Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Olivia, and I'm so glad to welcome all of you to today's gathering of Living One. This series, A Re-Enchanted World, was the culmination of this year's Living One theme, Seeing the Unseen, Restoration through Re-Enchantment. For those of you who don't already know, Living One is the Carrillo Center for Nonviolence's webinar series, now wrapping up its 6th year. The Carrillo Center for Nonviolence is a nonprofit dedicated to generating deep commitment and connection with the world and within ourselves, dissolving divides between human, plant, and animal, mind and body, science and spirit, and self and nature. Through teachings, practice, and community, Carrillo's catalyzes a shift in how we live, relate, and belong, because healing begins when we remember that we were never apart. Our third and final Living One series of 2025, A Re-Enchanted World, continues to explore the unseen, those parts of nature and ourselves obliterated and reduced by commodification. The mercantile, capitalist, realist Cartesian paradigm has supported scientific, technological, and industrial advances, but stripped our psyches and imaginations, even our very perceptions and understanding of the richly entangled, convivially connected nature of life on our living planet. Living One invites creative and committed people from around the world to discuss how to change our lives to serve all our plant and animal kin. Become a part of Earth revitalization by listening and learning with these amazing speakers. Our guest today is Dr. Jack Hunter. Dr. Hunter is an anthropologist exploring the borderlands of consciousness, religion, ecology, and the paranormal. He is an honorary research fellow with the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Research Centre, University of Wales, Trinity St. David, and a tutor at the Sophia Centre for the Study of Cosmology and Culture. He teaches on the Master of Arts in Ecology and Spirituality and the Master of Arts in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology. He is also a tutor for the Aleph Trust on their Master of Science in Consciousness, Spirituality, and Transpersonal Psychology, where he teaches on the Approaches to Consciousness module. He is the author of Manifesting Spirits, Spirits, Gods, and Magic, Ecology and Spirituality, and the Folklore of the Tanat Valley. He is the editor of Deep Weird, Greening the Paranormal, and Damned Facts, and co-editor of Talking with the Spirits, Mattering the Invisible, Folklore, People and Place, and Sacred Geography. He lives in the hills of mid-Wales with his family. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all currently on various Indigenous lands. I am currently on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. This land exists also as a place of trade with other Indigenous communities, including the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki. The Carrillo Center for Nonviolence is located on the homelands of the grizzly bear, takelma, daku bedite, coyote, coho salmon, golden eagle, and gray wolf. Finally, we ask that all of us participate with full respect and attention to each other in the spirit of peace and wisdom that Living One seeks to foster. Thank you all for being here. I will turn it over to Izzy and Dr. Hunter.
Thank you very much, Olivia, and welcome, Jack, to our gathering. And this is going to be a wonderful culmination of this series and indeed of the whole arc. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to sort of start off with the kind of who are you question. How did you get to be involved in drawing together three realms which could seem somewhat disparate in terms of ecology, spirituality, and the paranormal?
Yeah, well, my background is in anthropology, and I did my studies at the University of Bristol. So I did my undergraduate degree in archaeology and anthropology, and then my PhD was in social anthropology. And the theme for my PhD, the thing that I was researching, was spirit mediums. So it seems very far removed from ecology. But actually, I didn't realize it at the time, but there are many strands and threads that connect these two areas together. I didn't start to think about the connections until I undertook a permaculture course. I think it was about in 2016. I actually got a job in our local village working with a permaculture teacher who'd got funding to put together a permaculture curriculum really for secondary schools. That was what we were aiming to try to do. And as a part of that, I did the permaculture course. And it was just at the time when I was finishing off my PhD. And I started to see these kind of resonances between some of the ideas that I was coming up with in my mediumship research and some of the ideas that were coming at me from permaculture. So I'll give you one example. With mediumship, I'd come to the conclusion towards the end of my thesis, really, that if we really want to understand this experience, then we need to take a non-reductive approach. We don't want to break it down and try to explain it away in terms of psychology or in terms of sociology or anything like that. But we need to try to understand it in its broadest kind of context and as a culmination of all sorts of different processes. So psychological processes are involved, sociological processes, cultural processes, and we can extend that out further. Obviously, we all live within the environment, so there are environmental and ecological processes involved in that as well. So this is where I was moving. Like, we need to have a complexity model to understand the paranormal, and the complexity model that I was being shown was coming from ecology. You know, that ecology also emphasizes interconnectedness and complexity. Okay, so I started to see these resonances, and then I dug a little bit deeper and found that all sorts of different kinds of paranormal experiences, whether we're talking about sort of near-death experiences, seeing strange things, even things like alien abductions, have this kind of effect on people where they come back from this experience and then they're kind of like transformed. And there were a few studies that were published over the last few years that showed that one of the ways in which people were transformed after these kinds of extraordinary experiences was in the direction of enhanced nature connection, okay, connection to the natural world. People feel as though they've been shown something that they'd forgotten, and that is that they're connected to a wider kind of network of living beings. And you find this with, yeah, like I said, with near-death experiences, people who have these deathbed kind of visions often come back with a renewed sense of connection to nature. So it seemed that there was different kinds of strands involved in this. The modeling of ecology is useful for showing how we can use sort of complexity models to understand things. But also in the paranormal, there are these kind of green or ecological strands that, you know, to do with changing our behaviors or changing our perceptions. And the other strand of it, of course, is the non-human, because paranormal experiences of all different kinds are very often to do with encountering non-human beings, whether we're talking about ghosts or aliens or the Loch Ness monster, you know, and most of the world is non-human. So the paranormal is also about these kind of intimate, emotionally significant kind of relationships with the non-human world.
That it's so rich, and I mean, I drew from your from this one of your books, which is really fascinating, Ecology and Spirituality, a brief introduction. So for anyone out there who's inspired to, it's very, very clearly written and full of fascinating information from all those realms that you've mentioned so far. And you describe spirituality as concerned with how we orientate ourselves in the world, how we understand our place in the cosmos, and the narratives, concepts, categories, and symbols that we use to make sense of it. Spiritualities matter because they have a very real impact on the ways that we behave, and so also on the living environment around us. And it seems as if, within that description of spirituality, you could also see the kind of ideology, for example, of deep ecology, which I think has inspired you greatly.
Mm. Yeah, well, so there are many different ways that we can kind of think about what spirituality is. And, you know, we could go down sociological kind of routes and think about spirituality as kind of like belief systems like religion, you know, that bind communities together, give people shared sense of ideals. You can think about it in terms of, psychological functions like spirituality exists to help us to deal with grief or, you know, stresses in life and all of those kind of things. you could also define spirituality kind of phenomenologically from the perspective of, from within the spiritual tradition that you're in which case you'd end up with many different definitions of what spirituality is. And this is kind of the problem with spirituality. It's hard to pin down as one thing in particular, probably because it isn't one thing in particular, it's many different things. But to kind of overcome that problem of the difficulty of defining spirituality, I kind of shifted the emphasis a little bit towards, I suppose you could think of it more as kind of like worldview, or William James talked about personal personal religion, which doesn't have to have kind of religious components to it. It could be purely materialistic, but it's your kind of personal model of how the world works. And I like this idea of spiritual kind of orientations in the world, because you could have, different spiritual traditions point you in different directions. Yeah. And you can also develop your own kind of spiritual compass that you can help to navigate through the world. And, if we could think about it in terms of worldviews as well, sometimes these compasses that we have, we could call it spiritual, cosmological, they can have positive or negative impacts on the environment. There's an anthropologist called Roy Rappaport who talked about these as adaptive and maladaptive cosmologies. So we could say we could have adaptive and maladaptive compasses in the world, and some ways of living, some belief systems about the world encourage a form of behavior that is very extractive and destructive and individualistic. Maybe we could think about some capitalist ideologies, for example. And if you lived your life according to those rules of engagement, then your behavior is gonna, match that. It's going to be extractive and destructive. But if you can sort of adapt your orientation, your compass, to one that sees the world as alive, as made up of many different kinds of persons that we have to live in good relationships with, then our behavior also changes in that direction. So it's like an internal kind of compass. Um, yeah, more than anything, it's our ontological compass.
And it seems from what you said earlier as if those experiences like near-death experiences or an alien abduction or for me being spoken to by trees can have that be powerful enough as an epiphanic moment or an experience of the numinous to transition you from one kind of worldview into a different one, perhaps.
Yeah, they're kind of like pivot points, or times when a kind of a flip happens. In fact, Jeffrey Kripal has a great book. He's a historian of religions. He's got a great book called The Flip, which is all about these kinds of epiphanic kind of moments when something happens and all of a sudden your worldview, that your previous worldview is no longer kind of adequate, and you have to expand your horizons, expand your ideas about what things are real and what things, exist. Yeah.
So did you have that experience in the studies that you were doing, or were you already in a frame of mind that kind of mapped onto the area of study that you're now engaged in?
Well, a little bit of both, because early on in my life, I had a few things, little experiences that I'd had that changed my perceptions. I was brought up to be quite sort of skeptical of religion and spirituality and these kind of things from my parents, who were not really interested in any of that kind of stuff. Not anti it, but I was brought up to be kind of an atheist, I suppose. And for a long time, I had a real kind of quite a scientific view of the world. When I was a kid, I really thought in terms of well, reductionist science, and I was kind of mocking in myself of religion. But gradually, certain things started to steer me in different directions. One was doing religious education in school, which revealed to me, I think it's a very important subject. And I trained to be an RE teacher myself as well, to teach people about other ways of understanding the world. That's important. But I also had some experiences that suggested to me that there were other things going on as well. One early one that I remember, it wasn't actually my experience, but it was one of my sister's experiences, where she was for some reason sleeping on the floor in my room, on a mattress. And she woke up in the night and said that she had seen this little man in green clothes dancing on the shelf. And this kind of story kind of fascinated me. It's like, how can people have these kinds of experiences? And years later, when I must have been, I think I was about 15 or 16, I had my first magic mushroom trip. And it was during that trip I saw what I thought of at the time actually were fairies. Um, they were two-dimensional. They were in the grain of wood of a chest of drawers. There was a kind of like a top drawer was hanging out, and the panel along the side of the drawer had these little pointy-nosed, pointy-eared, kind of beautiful goblin-looking creatures. And they were moving along, kind of rolling along, tumbling along, kind of in a procession. It was what this procession that kind of clocked me. It turned in two dimensions. It was like an animation. It turned and uh,
You've just frozen, Jack. So when you come back, we'll be asking you to pick up from it was a two-dimensional animation. And at the moment, still frozen. See, this is the Wi-Fi in Wales. You want to live
yeah,
in Northampton.
no, it's bad here. I'm back. Where did I get up to? I was talking about.
You got up to it was like a 2D animation,
Yeah,
and you'd said they were rolling and tumbling.
yeah, they were like tumbling along, and at the head of this procession, um, there was one uh of, I don't know what they were, fairies, that kind of turned to me. And I was amazed by what I was seeing, and they were kind of not fussed by what they were seeing, which I thought was interesting. And they kind of carried on with their procession, and then I must have lost interest and drifted off to concentrate on something else. But for me, it was a really quite a powerful shifting moment. Got me thinking about a lot of things. I remember when I told my mum the next day when she came to pick me up from my friend's house, and I said that I'd seen fairies last night. And I got this negative response to it, which was probably, to be expected. But it got me thinking, why is it that there are some kinds of experiences that, it's okay to talk about? So imagine if I had had a sort of a vision of Jesus or something like that, or the Buddha or whatever. There's a kind of a framework to make sense of that kind of experience, and to a certain extent, it's more acceptable to have a vision of something like that than it is to have a vision of a fairy or an alien. There are certain kinds of experiences that are taboo, that people don't like, but that actually happen relatively frequently. So it got me thinking about all these kinds of issues, and that's really one of the reasons, anyway, why I ended up studying spirit mediums, because I was interested in why is it that people come to believe in these things, which at the time I was thinking of were irrational. Why is it that people come to believe in irrational things? And it seemed that spirit mediums would be a good people to talk to about that, because they're people whose lives are entwined with spirits on an everyday kind of basis. But I found that, quite quickly actually, that the reason, or a large part of the reason anyway, why, especially in this group of spirit mediums, why they believe in spirits is because they've had experiences that have led them to believe that. This is actually quite a simple answer to the question. People have strange experiences, and then that leads them into beliefs about the world, because sometimes their experiences go against what the kind of dominant models tell us can actually happen. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it, because these experiences prodded me and then made me realize that there were certain issues to be thought about with these kinds of experiences, and then I went to talk to other people about their experiences.
One of the things that I liked that you talked about, and it's something that I've been thinking about too, is that idea of psychodiversity, that there's a psychodiversity crisis, that we're all very much encouraged to share a one particular worldview. And along with that one particular worldview, certain aspects of consciousness are proscribed, and and so, I mean, the two things are kind of different, one being the worldview and one being the different experiences of consciousness. And I think that with that sort of like general worldview, that kind of reductionist scientific worldview, only one type of consciousness seems to be acceptable, whereas, as you know, William James said, there are probably as many different types of consciousness as there are beings. I'm misquoting, but I've thought about that as being someone who's, has aspects of neurodiversity, but also in thinking about the more than human world of, why should I assume that the consciousness of one of my cats is like that prescribed narrow form of consciousness that's of
Yeah.
my sort of like traditional culture. So have you how much have you sort of thought about those different elements of of consciousness aligning with particular worldviews?
Mm. Well, I mean, the idea of psychodiversity, I think, for me, it was one of those little light bulb moments. When we look at, we get taught about the ecological crisis in terms of yeah, biological stuff, biological matter. And there are all of these kind of like government initiatives and things, top-down projects to plant millions of trees, for instance. And the assumption that underlies all of that is that trees and the world around us is really something that we manipulate, and we change, we do things to suit us. We're going to plant all of these new trees so that we can reverse the damage that human beings have done to the planet. And there's no consideration for the possibility that trees have a deeper level to them. We're thinking of them kind of like as objects that we can use. And psychodiversity is saying, like, just in the same way that we say that, a healthy ecosystem is full of lots of different kinds of living organisms, biodiversity. All of these organisms also have this kind of subjective dimension to them. They have their own perceptions of the world. They have their own unique kinds of sensory apparatus to make sense and perceive the world. And there's also loads of interesting research emerging at the moment to suggest things like non-human cultures. We used to think of culture as something that was kind of unique to humans and that made us different from other living things. We say that human beings have got culture, so that makes us special. But there's now lots of evidence of things like tool use, for instance, amongst all sorts of different kinds of non-human animals. And tool use is interesting because it's not genetic information. It can't be passed on through the genes. Tool use is something that has to be learned and taught. So if animals are learning and teaching each other, then they have, repositories of knowledge, which is what, we would call culture, essentially. So when we lose biodiversity, we're not just losing organisms, physical things, we're also losing all of these cultural models that different species have developed, beliefs that they have about the nature of the world. And again, it might be a bit anthropocentric to think like this, but it's one aspect of it, is that, there's stuff that we could learn from that psychodiversity. And we've already lost 50% of it, in the last 50 years. So Yeah, I think when you start to realize that the living world is not just, living things, but it's also beings like we are, with consciousness, subjectivity, points of view, beliefs and things like that, then it's a real tragedy. It's tragedy enough, even if we think just biologically, but adding in that sort of psychological dimension to it as well is yeah.
Yes, it's a tragedy upon. I think um, the idea is kind of encapsulated in Deborah Bird Rose uses the term a double death, so
Mm,
that you have, I mean, this with extinction. So not only do you have, the death of the creatures, but the loss of this whole evolutionary cycle, but as that psychological evolutionary cycle as well, that's just gone.
God.
Um, I was going to talking about the sort of consciousness of the and of non-human animals. You're also in this particular book that I've read of yours talk about Monica Galliano's research into plants and the work that's been done on fungi. And I hadn't come across before reading your book this suggestion that a fungal lexicon is, can be as rich as our own. Could you give us an idea of this fungal lexicon?
Yeah. It's an interesting piece of research. It was done at the University of West of England in Bristol. And really what they did, they had two different to fungi essentially in the same kind of, matrix. So they're in the same bed. And they attached electrodes, at one end to the other. And they observed, they describe it as a lexicon, as possibly a language, but what they actually observed is that sort of packets of energy transfer. So, little packets of electrical activity, and they have different kind of spike lengths. So there are some that are longer than others, some that are smaller. Okay, and they're inferring that, these packets of energy are also, packets of information that are being exchanged from one organism to the next, one fungus to the other. But again, it just goes to show that we have this we have a very narrow idea about the capacities of all sorts of different non-human organisms, and this just goes to show that the kind of complexity of these systems of communication that have evolved in nature. A lot of language, like our languages are hugely, all of our human languages, so many of them as well, hugely complex kinds of systems, but it's not limited to the human. And there was an interesting study as well that I read about bats and their song cultures. Like they have different groups of bats seem to have different kinds of preoccupations, and they have, like in the same way that we have different traditions from one region to the next. It seems that you also have this with, different bat species. They have different ways of singing and vocalizing, and the same species, but they have different cultural systems. And so, we can extend that to the mushrooms and have their lexicon, and the trees and all of the other plants. And I think even the rocks and these kinds of things as well. We're in the Western setting, we think of rocks as almost like the pinnacle of inanimate things. But there are lots of, if we even just thinking kind of experientially about it, there, like you've had experiences of communication with trees. There are people who have had experiences of communication with rocks as well.
Well, there is I might have mentioned this on Living One before, but in between reading your book and this course, I went on it was called a pilgrimage run by the British Pilgrimage Society to Avebury, and Avebury is a large site of stone circles. It's not far away from Stonehenge, and it's actually vaster in terms of the scale of the site. For those of you who don't know, I imagine you're very familiar with it, Jack. And the sense of I mean, I was sort of walking with a group of people, and so there was this, it kind of like muffles your ability to really sort of be with the stones. But I did have a very profound sense of the sort of energy of these stones, and there has been a lot of research done by people who are engaged in, I suppose it's a kind of paranormal research about the sort of electrical or energetic emanations from these stones, combined with research into ley lines and other factors. And of course, as far as a sort of Western scientific paradigm is concerned, this is all kooky nonsense. But how would you, if you were researching that kind of understanding and that kind of research, what would be your sense of it from your perspective as an anthropologist?
Well, as an anthropologist, I would probably be approaching it slightly differently to the way that maybe a physicist or someone who's trying to work out the kind of infrasound or whatever the radiation of these things, because I would be thinking about the human kind of engagement with it. So what I would be doing if I was going to do a study of this would be, well, in fact, one of my students is doing a like your experience. One of my students at the moment is doing she's just finished her dissertation on communication with trees, and
Really?
yeah, and she's been interviewing people who've had, like you have, this kind of experience. So I would encourage people to do, a student of mine maybe to do the same kind of thing with
Yeah.
rocks. I would approach it from that kind of angle rather than going to measure the rocks, trying to find out if there are any radiations and things like that, which there could be, but rather focus on the experience and how it is that people experience communication with rocks. That would be my starting place.
And I mean, a person sort of approaching this from, let's create a straw man perspective of this sort of scientific reductionist paradigm, they could come in and say, well, obviously this is all nonsense, and why would you be researching it? And, these people are just wasting their lives. They might as well be counting rubber bands or blades of grass or something. What's the sort of, as someone who speaks to trees, how would you sort of counter that kind of sort of negative take?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that have had to think about quite a lot because, the paranormal as an area for research is automatically, people think of it as, yeah, irrational, um, non-existent. But what I have to do is say, you got to return to the data. And the data from human beings, is that these kinds of experiences and beliefs and things as well are remarkably common. They're not rare, even in the slightest. And because of that, they're a fundamental part of kind of the human condition. So I would say to a skeptic who was trying to convince me that this was all nonsense, I say, well, let's go and talk to people and see what data we actually collect and see how the real people out in the world understand these kinds of things. And then maybe we can see what's going on. So yeah, I think that's what I would say, that it's in people's experience, and I don't have to make that up. Other people are out there already telling stories of their encounters with trees and rocks, and they have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. So as an
Yes,
anthropologist, you're like, that's what we need to
yes.
investigate.
Yes, it's very interesting in that historical context that yes, this has been going on for hundreds and thousands of years, and so there is something very durable about these experiences, risking only being erased by a sort of skeptical paradigm, and it also seems that a lot within the connection, and you draw this connection between the sort of aliens as supra-terrestrial beings, as it were, between this an idea of an ecological self and this kind of openness to experience of relationality, or the admittance of conscious experience of those that we tend not to believe to be as conscious as they are. So could you just talk a little about the idea of the ecological self?
Yeah. Yeah. The it's a really, I find it a very useful concept. It's also another one of those points of overlap between my mediumship research and the kind of ecological field, which I found quite interesting. Because mediums are people who have would be described as, in the anthropological literature, people who have a porous sense of self. In anthropology, we talk about bounded individual selfhood, which is the kind of dominant model in Western industrial capitalist societies. So we have a very individualistic idea about what a person is, and personal development is the thing that we are driven towards, being incredibly individualistic and all of these kind of things, and accumulating wealth for ourselves and whatever. And then on the other hand, anthropologists have also noted a completely different kind of model of the self, which is sometimes referred to as porous, or sometimes as a relational self, where the self exists as part of a network of social relationships. So a good example is in sort of like in Japanese culture, where the individual person, or the single person, is only really a full person when they're in their kind of family, part of the community. When they're isolated from their community, then they're not a complete person. So they have this idea that, in order to be complete, we have to be interconnected with the people who are around us. Because this is like it's a different way of understanding what the self is. In the Western world, the self is very independent and isolated. Yeah, I've said the anthropologists call it bounded, or another term that's used is buffered. It's like there's a buffer between us and the world outside. Whereas the porous self is, yeah, the outside world kind of leaks in, and we leak out into the outside world. And if you have a porous notion of the way that, of consciousness or self, then things like spirits and that kind of thing can get involved. They can get into you. So there's all sorts of implications that come from having a porous self. So that's anthropology. And then there's the idea of the ecological self, which emerges out of deep ecology, and Arnie Ness and all of those kinds of guys. And he was saying that he kind of had a kind of like it's kind of like an evolutionary view of the self that eventually will transcend this very individualistic idea of selfhood and move into this notion of an ecological self, where the boundaries between self and other, between inner and outer worlds, becomes less solid. And this, he suggests that, when we enter into these states of ecological selfhood, that we establish, positive relationships with the natural environment around us. So there's an interesting thing here, where enhanced connection to nature emerges when we develop this ecological self, this more porous self. But also with the mediums, when you develop this ecological porous self, you have this kind of influx of other kinds of sensory experiences, which which in a Western framework we would label as paranormal or supernatural. But in an indigenous setting, it's hard to talk about indigenous settings, generalized, but there are many indigenous frameworks. But those kinds of distinctions are not necessarily made there. So yeah, I think that the ecological self is a cool concept, and it resonates really nicely with the paranormal kind of side of things. In fact, in parapsychology, they talk about boundary thinness as a trait amongst paranormal experiences. which is really interesting. I wonder if paranormal experiences are common amongst people who have this ecological self.
That is really interesting. I'm reading at the moment a book by Sean Kane called The Myth Tellers. You're familiar with that?
I haven't heard of it, no.
Oh, it's really interesting, and it's about myths. And I think his great aunt or his grandmother or someone was an Irish woman who was an Irish storyteller, and so it's really very interesting. I think you would like it. And there is a chapter in it that's specifically about boundaries and the important place that boundaries have in myths. So in one of the this is one of the Northern American, maybe the maybe the people who Richard Nelson was working with, the anthropologist Richard Nelson, some Northern indigenous group. And in one of their ideas of Raven crossing a boundary, it says his mind passed through and pulled his body with it. So to
Mm.
transition from the boundary of Earth into the heavens takes this effort, and it makes the distinction between an upper world, a middle world, and a low and the undersea world, but and the sort of but these boundary places where things happen and where you have to be very careful about crossing into another space. So there's an interesting way in which that idea of the boundary in the psyche is also represented with boundaries in the myth world of various communities. It's that struck me as sort of quite an interesting similarity. And I Sorry, that was just me getting excited by registering something that aligned with what I've just been reading. Um, do you feel that in these ways of becoming more porous in an ecological way or in terms of mediumship or whatever, that those kind of experiences lead to a greater sense of enchantment, or do you think that enchantment is always available, however boundaried or buffered your self may be?
Yeah, I think I like to think kind of in terms of like feedback loops. So or kind of like in cycles. And I think the same goes with things like enchantment and porous, sense of self, for example. So what I mean by that is, you could, if you developed this more porous sense of self, then you might have experiences that are more kind of enchanted, that you would label as enchanted. But the other side of it, it works in the other direction as well, and you can have an experience of enchantment that leads to, a mind blown experience, and which ultimately leads to porosity again. So it works in kind of both ways. We can change our mind and open ourselves up to these experiences, or we can have experiences that change our mind. And I think that there's something in that. It's interesting. One of the things I've been
It's very
interested in is, sorry.
like the experience that you had of those two-dimensional figures. That was the experience of enchantment that then opened you up to a greater porosity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you can have encounters with things in the world that I don't know what the best way to think of it. Maybe trigger is a good word, or activates, or something. Um, and I think this is true. There are certain sort of rocks or certain trees that kind of reach out to us or speak to us, or certain events that occur. It could be anything. And yeah, they kind of trigger this or activate this either enchantment or porosity. But either way, you end up, it's kind of like a spiral or a loop.
So what does enchantment mean to you? And do you have a feeling? I mean, we've called the series A Re-Enchanted World, and Patrick Curry said to us, "Wait a second, the world's never stopped being enchanted. What's stopped is our sort of appreciation of it." So we were sort of like, okay, maybe we mislabeled it then. But okay, re-enchanting our experience of the world isn't quite so catchy. But so what is it? Because I think what we've done through the arc of our trajectory this year is the first one was about attention, the ethics of attention, and that process of actually paying attention to the world around us, to other people, and to the more than human world. And then the next series was about the unseen. So though opening ourselves to the acceptance that there might be other aspects of life beyond those that we conventionally accept. And then this one is what that can lead to, and the idea that it can lead to a sort of greater openness to these experiences of enchantment. So kind of what I'm asking you is, how do you see, does that seem to be a sort of like a valid um and sort of like benevolent kind of journey, or are we at risk of just moving ourselves into cloud cookie land?
I think it's a benevolent journey. Um, I have this, like I've been saying, this idea about anti-reductionism, and I think that the the kind of weirder our ideas are about the world, and the more complex they are, the more resonant they're going to be with the way that the world actually is. I think that
Wow.
the world is chaotic and is has all of these different kinds of processes that are going on simultaneously, and we're only thinking about the world here, but it expands off into the cosmos as well. So simple explanations are not going to kind of cut the mustard, and we need complex kinds of models. And these complex models kind of they do entail things that get labeled as woo-woo. But it's things like the sentience of the natural world and all of this kind of stuff. These are the ideas that emerge out of this. They do get labeled as woo-woo, but they are kind of central. And they're weird ideas, but that's because the world is weird. That's why they resonate and make sense. Um, so yeah, I don't know where I'm really going with it, but I think that yeah, complex ideas are the thing that we should be aiming for, not simple ideas. Complex ideas that engage with all sorts of different kinds of possibilities um, for the way that the world could be as well. So, not limiting ourselves to any single model, but kind of trying to be open to lots of different ways of understanding the world as well.
I love that. And I'm wondering whether you feel that there is any kind of whether there's an ethical value to this kind of perspective and what that
Mm.
might be.
I think that there is because like we said earlier, it's these deep, um, whether we call them philosophical ideas or spiritual ideas about the world or our personal orientation or whatever it is. It's these things that kind of influence and give meaning to the behaviors that we, follow through with. So there's a kind of an ethics kind of embedded within that. If your worldview, like with animism, if your worldview entails that the world is full of persons that you have to live in good relationship with, then that's the strategy that you need to apply to living. And it's an ethical framework. It's about establishing positive relationships and not exploiting uh, other beings. So there's that real sort of ethical aspect to it, and which is very different to the dominant models that we have in the West at the moment, which are all about, like I've said, exploitation, extraction,
Mm.
deconstruction, reductionism, and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah.
I've been hogging the show by by being so fascinated in everything that you have to say. And I will just ask one more question and then encourage people to put up their hands or write something into the chat. And the final thing, Jack, really is to ask, as a result of the work that you've been doing and the experiences that you've had and the experiences that you've been told about, how has your perspective as a person changed, and maybe your ethics and your actions too?
Yeah. Um, I feel like it's I have been changed over the time of my life. Um, I've gone through different kinds of phases of understanding. Um, but the experiences that I've had have always sort of challenged the kind of comfort that I end up in occasionally. Um, and I think that's one of the good things about this kind of area is that it is weird and it's surprising and it operates in a way that kind of exceeds our expectations, shifts us, pushes us into different ways of thinking. And what I've tried to do really is to let myself be pushed by the weirdness and to take it seriously. This is why I have a book called Deep Weird. And the idea with that is, we can take a surface level approach to the weird. We can be impressed by its strangeness and oddness. And, a lot of popular kind of paranormal stuff is just about that, really. It's shock value kind of stuff. Or we can think deeply about what these kinds of experiences actually mean. What kind of a world do they suggest that we're living in? And that's what I've been trying to do, and to think deeply about these kinds of experiences that are marginalized or rejected even, and to ask, do they help us to understand other questions? In anthropology, does taking the paranormal seriously help us to reframe old debates or to look at things from a different perspective? Or does bringing a paranormal dimension into our understanding of ecology change the way that we engage with, the living world? So it has changed me, and I think it's going to keep changing me as well. Keep pushing me in different directions, and that's part of having what I call a non-reductive approach, is that it has to keep kind of growing and expanding and bringing in new information and new ideas. So yeah, all of this stuff, all of what I'm saying, is me and is a product of the work and ideas that I've been exploring through my whole life, really.
It is acknowledging yourself as a becoming rather than as a being, I suppose,
As
that
a
you are.
finished product.
Yeah, yeah, that you're always in this state of transition and state of growth. And I think we can feel sort of that there is a point that we want to get to. We can be very sort of, rigid about it needs to go that way, and everything that isn't that way is rubbish. And once I get there, everything will be fine. And maybe that's not such a helpful paradigm as the paradigm of exploration and of that knowledge that you're never there. You're not going to be there. You're always going to
Yeah.
be journeying.
And of not straight lines, but spirals and meanderings as well. So don't think of it as a linear trajectory. Um, yeah.
Very much like the gnarled branches of an oak tree.
Yeah. Stretching out into the cosmos.
Exactly, exactly, and drawing the energy from the sun and bringing it deep into the earth, and so many other things that I get overexcited about with trees. Um, um, do we have any questions from the audience? You're all welcome to unmute yourselves and ask Jack if you have anything specific. I wondered if we had someone talking in the middle series about near-death experiences, Pim van Lommel, and yes, and he was sort of very much made the point that these near-death experiences did tend to, encourage that sense of oneness, and connection, and a sort of profound appreciation for the natural world. So that does relate specifically to what you were saying. I do find it quite fascinating that, the alien abduction
Yeah,
experiences have seem to have a similar impact, which I just wouldn't have expected.
it's interesting. It's actually a theme if you look at the history of UFOs going right back, even into, well, the UFOs go way, way back into in human history, but the kind of modern UFO craze started off in the 1950s, 1940s and 50s. And even then, um, the contactees, as they were called then, people who claimed to have been aboard flying saucers and things like that, were being shown by the Venusians. It was often usually people from Venus in those days, were telling people about nuclear destruction and these kinds of things, the dangers of nuclear annihilation, and
Wow.
people were given images of a sort of a planet that had been destroyed through nuclear war, and then these contactees would come back from these with a new message for people, which was about nuclear disarmament and protection for the planet. And then later on, you start to get the alien abduction experience emerging, which is quite a different kind of thing. And I've got a few ideas about why it might trigger a kind of ecological perspective. One of them is it might be in some ways that that alien abductions is a similar kind of experience to the near-death experience, or there might be similar processes that are involved. So that's one possibility, and that all of these experiences share certain processes underneath them that are similar, and that's why an alien abduction gives rise to nature connection like a near-death experience does. But another possibility is that it relates back to, I can't remember who it was. Was it possibly Val Plumwood,
Yeah.
one of the kind of
The
ecological philosophers?
crocodile. The
The
crocodile.
crocodile. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
Val Plumwood.
Yeah, and she was snapped up by the crocodile, and was put into the death twist and all of that kind of stuff. And it was in that moment that she realized that she was actually a part of this ecosystem, that she wasn't separate from it. She'd been living in her kind of human bubble all that time, and then she gets snapped out of it. And I think that something like that might also be going on with these kind of alien abduction scenarios, or even if they are illusory or they don't exist or whatever it is. You know, the having the experience of being plucked out of your comfort zone and put into a cosmos where you're not at the top of the food chain anymore, where there are other
Yeah.
beings who are more powerful than you or whatever it is. And I think that maybe, at least in some scenarios, where this kind of thing happens, it's that kind of event. It's realizing actually that we're part of a bigger system which we had not been aware of before, which snaps us into, yeah, an ecological awareness.
Yes, one of the other things that you mentioned in that book, which I thought was really interesting, we were talking about you were talking about there is this environmental crisis. Climate change is happening. There's loss, extinctions are happening, biodiversity loss, and and we don't seem to kind of change through the tools the tools of hard science and hard research. And you suggested that looking through the lens of the soft lens of softer subjects might actually encourage a greater transition towards more sort of ecocentric style of being. Could you just speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, well, again, it's like I've been saying that, if we approach it from the perspective of our beliefs and our attitudes and these kinds of things, from the soft social sciencey kinds of angles, it it immediately has, much more relevance to us than the very physical kind of, um, like carbon in the atmosphere, for example. It's a very, it's almost an abstract
Mm.
in our experience. It's very disconnected from us. And I think, a lot of people just don't connect with the idea of it. You can't see it and all those kinds of things. So, the science gives us it presents a very kind of matter of fact view of the world, but it's one that is almost kind of meaningless to a lot of people, especially if it doesn't have any relevance to your immediate life. Whereas talking to people about their beliefs and how they understand the nature of the world and these kinds of things, what their attitudes are, what people's assumptions are, is a kind of like a shortcut to actually, the behavioral stuff that needs to change. And the science, it presents this image, but it doesn't tell us how to communicate these ideas, or how to talk about it with people. Um, yeah, so I think, a softer kind of approach is what's actually needed, the way you engage people in conversation about
Mm.
things, about issues, and get people to think about things, and in a way that's relevant and meaningful to their lives. And I think that any kind of change is really gonna. I've been talking about this quite a bit recently because I don't really like the idea of kind of trying to change people. Uh, but what I do like is the idea is sort of being able to give people new concepts or new ideas or new formulations, even just formulations of words in different orders, like deep, weird, or psychodiversity, or something like that. But like paranormal experiences, a reformulation of words can just suddenly make something click, on an individual level, and people can use these concepts or these tools to change their own minds. And so we don't have to change people, but people can change themselves.
Like those words act as like a mini moment of enchantment, that the word is a key that opens a lock into more porosity.
And an enchantment well, it's about singing, chanting.
Yes. Yeah.
So, it's words are magic.
Yes, words are magic, and you've been using them most wonderfully for the last hour, and I thank you very much. It seems as if I have engrossed, well, that I have asked so many questions that I've left viewers short of
That's
anything
right.
further to add. But I don't know if there's anything final that you wanted to draw to our attention about enchantment, or about a suggestion for how we can individually increase our porosity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's all sorts of different ways that you can do it, but I think the simplest ways are often good. To actually go out into the world and, spend time with a tree or with a rock, and or in your garden. It's very simple stuff. Um, it's everyday stuff, but really kind of participate and, engage with these things and see what happens. You know, that's what I would suggest. People often ask me, because about the paranormal kind of thing, and about how can I, learn how to communicate with spirits and things like that. And it's not really my job to teach people how to do that. I'm not a guru or anything, but I would say, now I say anyway, go in the garden and see the spirits that are there, the plants and, the slugs and the snails and things like that, and see that when I talk about, a living network of minds and beings, that it's actually just out there in the world, waiting to be seen and engaged with. So yeah, that's what I would say.
It brought me, this is Gay speaking. I'm sorry, I can't get my video to work. But thank you so much. That was phenomenal, Izzy. It just reminds me of a saying I heard years ago. Actually, he was from Silicon Valley, and I think his name is Guy Kawasaki. And he said, sometimes you have to believe in order to see, you know. And I think that not believing is seeing or seeing is believing. I think it's sometimes you believe and then you see.
Yeah.
Anyways, that was just a comment. What you were saying is I think that is, at least in my experience, the biggest barrier, and to really kind of, as what's his name, Ray Bradbury said, follow your fancy,
Mm.
and there, it's like Alice in Wonderland. You know what I mean? It just, everything starts opening up.
Yeah.
Thank you so
But
much.
one thing I would add to that, or slightly adjust it, because I always say that I don't sort of believe in anything really. I kind of find it hard to imagine, what it is to have complete faith in something. But what I do say is that I think a lot of things. So, I don't necessarily say, but you have to believe it in order to experience it, but think these things, think through them, use the concepts, and you don't have to believe in something as essentially fundamentally true or anything like that, but you can think through them. Okay, and it kind of means that you're free to explore all sorts of different ways of thinking about the world without having to necessarily believe in anything.
Well, I guess I would say that it doesn't necessarily mean, well, Carl Jung said, when he was asked about what happens after he dies, and he said, I don't believe, I know. And I
Mm,
think that's the element, which I think, what I was trying to say with the belief thing. I don't know what Guy Kawasaki said, but I really liked it.
yeah, yeah,
But
no, I like.
it's not necessarily belief. I think this is, also the as you know, or this is the kind of the friction point, or the tripping stone is, that you have to believe in something, and then there's this, the spirituality, and the, at least in these sectors of the world, I don't know, which I guess we just called it the weird or the Western, whatever.
Yeah.
This sort of sense of paranoia about believing or not believing in something. I
Mhm.
guess it seems to me, it's like, wow. I mean, my own experience is that, I just assume. Maybe the word is assume. I just assume that, when I am outside with the animals and the trees and everything, that there's this full blown conversations and, dialogues that are going on, and
Mhm.
that in itself is, it's an opening in that way. It's
Yeah.
almost just like you said, the porosity. So I guess that was the thing, is that, that I wrestle with, is there's such a push, at least in, like I said, this sector, to talk about spirituality or religion. And there's such an oversimplification, of what quote unquote religion is. I was brought up, well, I don't say like you, but, my mother was rather pagan. My father was just sort of like, he was raised Episcopalian, and it was okay, but we didn't do any of those things. We were just like this pagan family that ran around naked out here in the woods. Um, and there wasn't any belief in anything in that sense. I think that's a real hurdle that I encounter, is how do you get, like, for example, Diksha and I are doing some teaching on Thich Nhat Hanh and Zen Buddhism. As soon as you say the B word, I mean, that's how it feels. As soon as you
Mhm.
say the word, all of a sudden there's a category, and there's a resistance, and there's like all these assumptions that start accreting. So your
Yeah.
comment also about, using different words, linguistic, navigation is really important, I think, just to get around all that, because we get these labels, and all of a sudden you're on that track, and that's the end of it right there.
Yeah. No, it's true. Yeah, it limits our thinking in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you so much. It was just lovely.
Thank you very much.
And Eileen, you've got your hand up.
Hi, yeah. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good, because I'm using my headphones. I can't hear myself the same way as usual. Um, I wanted to add on to kind of what Gay was saying, and at the end she said a little bit of what I wanted to say, which is that, you know, as a very young child, I had a lot of trauma, and I can remember being in the hospital room in the dark and looking out at the stars and thinking, that's where I belong.
Mm.
And from that moment, I don't think it ever has changed for me that there's all kinds of things going on that I don't know about and I can't see, and how limited we are, and that I expected them to be there. And then, of course, I was raised very much as you and Gay were, which was really not, it was really almost anti-religion. Both my parents had been raised in the Catholic Church. So they were actually anti-religion, but not anti-spirituality. And things like UFOs, aliens, spirits, my mother was very open to them. And my connection to it was animals. I wanted to be like Dr. Dolittle because I felt I was only able to, I'll use the word access or participate. It wasn't that sophisticated as a child, but that I only was getting part of the picture. And that I really wanted to be able to talk to them about what they were feeling. And I've always felt that about trees too. And what I wanted to add to this that I think is quite interesting, and Gay knows this from my work with animals also, and stuff we worked on together, that, anthropomorphism is like the number one, that you do not break that rule.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, there's a difference depending who breaks that rule. An academic who's a man, white man, like Mark Beckhoff, gets to break that rule all the time. If Gay or I break it, then we're woo-woo and crazy and overly emotional. What I wanted to really add to this, though, is that, I have assumed that, and anybody who's lived with animals, a cat or a dog or a goldfish even, knows that animals are more than just instinct and cause and effect. I think we deny that, and we that's taught out of us. And one of the things in working in the end of life space that we talk about a lot is that, the science is caught up with the fact that we have a spirit, we have energy that is in our body. Energy can only change form. So quantum physics has in many ways caught up with what humans have always experienced and tried to understand and make sense of through religion. And yet I think it's kind of sad that we need that in our Western world, we need math to tell us that this is true. And it's sort of what Gay started with. Sometimes that quote, and I love it, that you need to believe in order to see. If you've already decided it's not there, it's never going to happen. And I've had things that have happened to me that have surprised me. And it's like, well, hey, maybe this is just another example of my limitations, just like other species have different ways of understanding the world and navigating. So sometimes I think it's kind of sad that the paranormal gets so put, and even the alien abduction, because there's a commonality to it amongst experiencers, which is also very weird to me. Yeah. that it would be the same. I mean, there are commonalities. Maybe that comes from a human psyche. Maybe that's, kind of the mythology of the archetype that shows up. I don't know. But I could talk about this all day. If you went on all weekend talking about this, people sharing experiences, and what do they mean, I think is phenomenal, and just being open to it. Last thing I wanted to say is I have read that often people who do not have healthy, what are considered healthy psychological boundaries or emotional boundaries, are often those who experience the quote unquote term much more frequently than others. And that's been noted by psychologists and sort of anecdotally, not studied, but maybe that's one of the gifts that comes out of being neurodiverse in some way. And I'm using that term very loosely, not the exact definition of it. So thank you for this whole subject and being willing to explore it.
Thanks for sharing.
Yes, thank you, Eileen. And Jack, thank you so much for your time this evening and for your work. And as I said, I mean, I haven't read the other books, but I can heartily recommend this one, which is available from all good booksellers. Not just the one named after the jungle where I probably bought it. But anyway, thank you so much, Jack. And I'm going to hand over to Olivia to close this session.
Thank you so much, Jack. That was amazing and so just fascinating and inspiring. So thank you so much and for all the time you shared with us today. And thank you to all of our audience for being here. I'm going to close us out by introducing you to one of our Grace Village members. But before we do that, today is our final session of Living One for this series of our 2025 Living One theme, Seeing the Unseen, Restoration through Re-Enchantment. So I just wanted to thank all of you for being here for this incredible year of speakers and conversations. It's been so special. And we do have one more Living One offering to close out 2025 that we will be announcing shortly on our email and website in the coming weeks. So you guys can all keep your eyes peeled for that. But yes, as promised, we will close out with one of our lovely Grace Village residents. Let me get my screen shared. This is Elsie. She is probably just over a year old and has sustained a neurological backbone injury, possibly from either a coyote or a fox. She is paraplegic, and the next slide here, let's see if I can get it. There we go. This shows her path to where she lives under the little barn at Grace Village. Every day, Gay gives her food right next to the barn so she can be inside and underneath and still reach out for her food and water because getting to water and food outside of the barn really puts her at risk. So Gay leaves water and nuts and fruit and other various things that she likes to eat where it's easy for her to reach. She is beautiful and strong and a wonderful part of our ground squirrel community at Grace Village. And as always, your support goes to helping residents like Elsie and all others thrive in our community and outside. So thank you everybody for being here and for sharing all of your time and energy with us today. It's wonderful to be here with all of you, and we look forward to seeing you shortly.